Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, all the way to ancient Rome, but not the Rome you usually hear about. Forget the noble senators and the stoic gladiators for a moment. Instead, imagine yourself strolling through the bustling forum, the scent of fresh bread mingling with the dust, and the cacophony of street vendors hawking their wares. You pass by a group of citizens, their faces unusually grim. A child giggles, and immediately an older man shushes them, glancing around nervously. Why? Because you're living under the reign of a Roman emperor who, astonishingly, tried to ban laughter. Yes, you heard that right. A whole empire, a bustling, vibrant society under an imperial edict against mirth. You probably wouldn't survive a week before a stray snicker landed you in a peculiar predicament. It's a concept so absurd, so utterly counter to human nature, it almost sounds like a bad dream. But for a brief, bewildering period, it was a very real, very peculiar reality. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see how far these sleepy historical journeys travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins with a young man, barely a teenager, who would become one of Rome's most unconventional emperors, Elagabalus. Born Varius Avitus Bassianus in Emesa, Syria, around 203 AD, his name alone sounds like something out of a fantasy novel, doesn't it? He wasn't born into the purple of the Roman aristocracy. Instead, his lineage was tied to the venerable sun, god Elagabal. His grandmother, Julia Mesa, was the sister of Empress Julia Domna, who was the wife of Emperor Septimius Severus. This familial connection, tenuous as it might seem to a modern eye, placed him squarely within the powerful Severan dynasty, but it wasn't a direct line to the throne. Instead, it was through a fascinating blend of political machinations, religious fervor, and perhaps a touch of desperate opportunism that this Syrian boy would find himself propelled onto the most powerful seat in the Western world. Imagine being a kid, growing up in a place like Emesa, which was a significant religious center, steeped in the worship of a local sun deity. Your life revolves around ancient rituals, grand temples, and the mesmerizing power of the sun. Then, suddenly, you're told you're going to be emperor of the greatest empire the world has ever known. It's quite the leap, from priestly robes to imperial purple, and the transition wasn't exactly smooth. Historians still argue whether his grandmother, Julia Mesa, was truly a master manipulator or simply a desperate matriarch trying to preserve her family's dwindling influence. Either way, her gamble paid off, at least for a while. You see, the Roman Empire at this point, the early 3rd century AD, was a bit of a mess. After the assassination of Emperor Caracalla, Julia Mesa saw an opportunity to restore her family's power. She cleverly spread rumors that Elagabalus was, in fact, Caracalla's illegitimate son, a tale that was, shall we say, highly improbable. But in the chaotic world of Roman succession, sometimes a good story was all you needed. She presented him as a savior, a divinely appointed ruler, and crucially, one who had the backing of the legions stationed in Syria. The soldiers, perhaps weary of political instability and drawn to the charismatic young priest, declared him emperor in 218 AD. This was a direct challenge to the reigning Emperor Macrinus, who was also the man who had supposedly ordered Caracalla's death. The stage was set for a showdown. It's almost comical, isn't it? A teenager, propelled to power by a grandmother's cunning and a legion's loyalty, all in the name of a sun god. You can almost hear the Roman establishment collectively groan, "Oh, not another one." Yet here he was, this unexpected figure, ready to shake up the very foundations of Roman society in ways no one could have predicted. Think about it. You're a hardened Roman legionary. You've seen battles, you've seen emperors come and go, and suddenly you're swearing allegiance to a young priest who spends his days in elaborate rituals. It must have been a bewildering experience. His ascension wasn't just a political shift, it was a cultural clash waiting to happen. Elagabalus, steeped in Syrian religious traditions, had little understanding or, frankly, respect for the established Roman customs and traditions. He brought with him not just his claim to the throne, but also his devotion to the sun god, Elagabal, a deity represented by a black conical stone. This stone, a rather unassuming object to Roman eyes, would become central to his reign. The idea that this foreign deity would be elevated above the traditional Roman pantheon, above Jupiter himself, was an affront to many. It was a sign of things to come, a precursor to the bizarre and often controversial decisions that would define his short but unforgettable time on the imperial throne. The stage was set for a reign unlike any Rome had ever seen, a reign where the unusual became the norm, and where eventually even laughter itself would face an imperial ban. So you're in Rome, 219 AD. News has just arrived that this young Syrian priest, Elagabalus, has actually defeated Macrinus. Suddenly, this seemingly improbable claim to the throne has become a very real, and for many Romans, a very disconcerting reality. Imagine the whispers in the forum, the uneasy glances among the senators. They'd expected a seasoned general, perhaps another stoic Severin, but certainly not a flamboyant teenager steeped in a foreign sun cult. He marched on Rome, not with the typical military fanfare of a conquering general, but with something far more theatrical. He arrived with his retinue, and it wasn't just a few dusty soldiers. Oh no, this was a spectacle. Think less triumphant general, more rock star, with a penchant for very, very elaborate costumes. He arrived draped in silk, robes embroidered with gold, and adorned with jewelry that would make even the most ostentatious Roman matron blush. His retinue was equally colorful. You see him pass, his face made up with cosmetics, his hair styled in a way that was utterly alien to Roman sensibilities. This was a man who clearly had no interest in conforming to Roman ideas of masculine austerity or imperial decorum. His appearance alone was a deliberate provocation, a stark contrast to the expected gravitas of an emperor. You can almost hear the collective gasp from the Roman elite as he made his entrance. It was like showing up to a formal gala in your pajamas, except your pajamas are made of solid gold and your head is adorned with a tiara of exotic feathers. The very first impression he made was one of radical difference. While previous emperors might have indulged in personal eccentricities, they usually maintained a public facade of Roman virtue and tradition. Elagabalus, however, seemed intent on dismantling that facade entirely. He wasn't just bringing his sun god to Rome, he was bringing his entire cultural framework, which was deeply at odds with Roman norms. For instance, Roman emperors were expected to be serious, to project an image of military prowess and civic responsibility. Elagabalus, by contrast, seemed to revel in a more flamboyant, almost hedonistic lifestyle. From day one, this wasn't just about personal taste, it was a challenge to the very idea of what a Roman emperor should be. Historians still argue whether this was a deliberate strategy to assert his foreignness and divine connection, or simply the unchecked indulgences of a sheltered youth suddenly given absolute power. Perhaps a bit of both, seasoned with a dash of teenage rebellion. Imagine yourself as a senator, a man who has spent his life upholding Roman traditions, participating in solemn religious rites, and debating the future of the empire in dignified tones. Then this boy emperor arrives, parading through the city with an entourage of dancing girls and musicians, and openly mocking the very institutions you hold dear. It must have felt like a direct assault on everything you knew. His very presence was a kind of culture shock. He wasn't just ignoring Roman customs, he was actively subverting them. He brought with him the black stone of Elagabal, a meteorite which he declared to be the most sacred object in the empire. This stone, not the traditional Roman gods, was to be the supreme deity. You can imagine the murmurs, the disbelief, the quiet outrage. It was as if someone had declared a common pebble to be more sacred than the entire pantheon. This was not just a religious shift, it was a power grab, a symbolic dethroning of Jupiter himself. His initial actions upon arriving in Rome further cemented his reputation for unusual behavior. Instead of focusing on matters of state or military campaigns, his primary concern seemed to be the establishment of his sun god, Elagabal, as the paramount deity of Rome. He ordered the construction of a magnificent temple, the Elagabalium, on the Palatine Hill, right in the heart of imperial power. And not just any temple, it was to be the grandest, most opulent temple Rome had ever seen, designed to house the sacred black stone. You can picture the Roman architects scratching their heads, trying to reconcile their classical sensibilities with the emperor's exotic tastes. This wasn't just about building a place of worship, it was a declaration, a bold statement that the old ways were to be swept aside, replaced by something new and utterly alien. He would personally participate in the daily rituals, not in the traditional Roman priestly robes, but in his flamboyant Syrian attire, dancing around the altar. This would have been truly shocking to the Roman populace. Imagine your head of state, the ultimate authority, performing what they considered to be strange, almost pagan, dances in public. It was undignified, unheard of, and utterly disrespectful to their sensibilities. It was almost like watching a foreign circus parade through the solemn halls of power. You'd be half amused, half horrified, and entirely bewildered. This behavior wasn't just a deviation, it was a complete rejection of Roman dignity. He was essentially telling them, my gods are better, my ways are better, and you will conform. This was not the subtle assimilation of foreign cults that Rome had grown accustomed to. This was a forced conversion, a wholesale imposition of a new religious order backed by the absolute power of the emperor. And it was all just beginning. You're watching this unfolding spectacle in Rome, and the shock just keeps building. Elagabalus wasn't just bringing his sun god, he was bringing his entire lifestyle, which was, to put it mildly, deeply un-Roman. His personal habits, his fashion choices, his entire approach to the imperial role were a direct affront to the dignity and gravitas expected of a Roman emperor. You might imagine the whispers, the snickering behind cupped hands, and the exasperated sighs from the older, more traditional senators. It's almost like watching someone try to fit a square peg into a very, very round, very ancient hole. One of the most striking aspects of his early reign was his complete overhaul of Roman religious practice. He didn't just build a temple for Elagabal, he tried to make his sun god the supreme deity above all others. This wasn't a subtle integration, like the Romans often did with foreign cults. This was a direct replacement. He even ordered the transfer of the most sacred Roman relics to the Elagabalium, including the Palladium, a wooden statue of Pallas Athena believed to protect Rome, and the sacred fires of Vesta. Imagine the Vestal Virgins, sworn to protect these fires, suddenly having them moved to a new temple dedicated to a foreign god. It would be akin to moving the Statue of Liberty to a new shrine dedicated to a deity from another planet. It was a deeply unsettling act for many Romans, shaking the very foundations of their religious and civic identity. Elagabalus himself would personally lead the daily devotions to his god, performing elaborate, almost theatrical rituals. He would dance around the altar, clad in his flamboyant Syrian robes, often accompanied by female attendants and musicians. This would have been utterly shocking to Roman sensibilities. Roman state religion was solemn, dignified, and ritualized, not a lively performance. You can picture the baffled expressions of the common citizens and the barely concealed disdain of the patricians as they witnessed their emperor gyrating in front of a giant black stone. It was a bizarre blend of religious fervor and performance art, and it was deeply alien to the Roman psyche. Historians still argue whether his religious zeal was genuine piety or a calculated move to centralize power around himself as the divine intermediary, perhaps a bit of both, with a generous helping of youthful hubris. Beyond the religious reforms, his personal life became a continuous source of scandal and gossip. He openly flouted traditional Roman gender roles, often appearing in women's attire and makeup. He was said to have worked as a prostitute in taverns and brothels, and even offered vast sums of money to any physician who could give him female genitalia. This was not just a personal quirk, it was a public declaration that directly challenged the very rigid gender norms of Roman society. For a Roman emperor, the epitome of masculine virtue and power, to behave in such a way was seen as an abomination, a profound insult to Roman ideals. You'd be looking at him, thinking, is this a joke? Is this real life? It was certainly real, and it caused a considerable amount of discomfort and outrage among the conservative Roman elite. It's safe to say he wasn't exactly winning over the traditionalists. His marriages were equally unconventional. He married Vestal Virgin Aquilia Severa, a move that was considered sacrilege and carried the death penalty for a Vestal. He justified it by claiming it would produce godlike children, which probably didn't soothe many ruffled feathers. He also had several male lovers and reportedly married one of them, a charioteer named Hierocles, referring to him as his husband. This blatant disregard for Roman marital and sexual conventions further alienated him from the aristocracy and the populace. Imagine the sheer audacity of this young emperor, casually breaking every social taboo in the book. It wasn't just progressive, it was, for his time, revolutionary in its defiance and deeply, deeply offensive to many. You can almost feel the collective clutching of pearls across the Roman elite. Even his daily routine was extraordinary. He would dine on exotic dishes, reportedly serving ostrich brains and peahens' tongues at his banquets, and ordering his guests to be served entirely different meals from his own, just to be eccentric. He was known for his lavish and bizarre public displays of wealth, like scattering gold and silver coins from the balcony of the palace to the crowds below. This might sound generous, but it was often done in a way that caused chaos, with people scrambling and fighting for the coins. It was less about charity and more about creating a spectacle, a kind of opulent performance art designed to shock and entertain. Imagine a modern celebrity just throwing handfuls of cash into a mosh pit. It's a fleeting moment of excitement, followed by general bewilderment and perhaps a few bruised ribs. This was Elagabalus's idea of a good time. This early period of his reign established a pattern, constant subversion of norms, an unwavering focus on his personal desires and religious convictions, and a general disregard for the opinions of the Roman establishment. He was, in essence, an emperor who refused to play by the rules, and in doing so, he set the stage for even stranger edicts to come. The groundwork was being laid for an environment where even a simple, spontaneous laugh could be seen as an act of rebellion. The Romans were about to find out just how serious this peculiar young emperor was about his unique vision for the empire, even if that vision involved a profound lack of joy. You'd find yourself walking on eggshells, constantly wondering what strange new decree tomorrow might bring. You've seen him arrive, the spectacle, the defiance of Roman tradition. Now, Elagabalus, firmly ensconced as emperor, turned his full attention to what he clearly considered his most important imperial duty, establishing the cult of his son, god Elagabal, as the supreme religion of Rome. This wasn't just a personal preference, this was a state religion in the making, and it was going to be pushed with all the might of the imperial office. Imagine the scene: grand processions, unlike anything Romans had ever witnessed, winding through the city streets. You'd see the sacred black stone, the symbol of Elagabal, being paraded on a chariot, often pulled by 6 white horses, with the emperor himself walking backward in front of it, guiding the horses in an act of profound reverence. It was a bizarre inversion of traditional Roman triumphs, where the general rode forward, basking in the adoration of the crowd. Here, The emperor was almost secondary to the god, a peculiar humility that somehow felt more arrogant than humble. He built the magnificent Elagabalium on the Palatine Hill, a temple designed to outshine all other Roman religious sites. This was to be the spiritual heart of the new empire, where the black stone would reside. But it wasn't just about constructing a grand edifice. Elagabalus attempted to merge all traditional Roman deities into the worship of Elagabal, Jupiter, Mars, Minerva. They were all to become aspects or subordinate figures to the supreme sun god. This syncretism, while not entirely new to Roman religion, was being forced with an unprecedented intensity and a complete disregard for existing hierarchies. Imagine a Roman priest who has dedicated his life to Jupiter suddenly being told that his god is now just a lesser entity under this foreign sun deity. It would be deeply unsettling, like being told the rules of gravity had suddenly changed. He even forced senators and high ranking officials to participate in the daily rituals, regardless of their own religious beliefs. You'd see dignified, elderly senators, perhaps still secretly muttering prayers to their traditional gods, standing awkwardly in elaborate Syrian robes, forced to observe and even partake in rituals that were utterly alien to them. They'd have to endure the emperor's strange dances and the chanting in a foreign tongue. It was a humiliating experience for many, a public display of submission to a god they neither understood nor revered. It was a subtle, yet profound exercise of power, forcing compliance through ritual. Historians still argue whether the Roman populace genuinely embraced or merely tolerated these religious changes. While some undoubtedly found the exoticism appealing, the majority likely viewed it with a mix of confusion, apathy, and quiet resentment. The rites themselves were unusual. There were elaborate sacrifices, not of the traditional Roman variety, but often involving large numbers of oxen and sheep, which were then offered to the sun god. Accounts describe strange, almost orgiastic ceremonies, though the details are often exaggerated by hostile Roman sources trying to paint Elagabalus in the worst possible light. Regardless of the exact nature of these rites, they were certainly outside the norm for Roman state religion, which tended to be more formal and less overtly passionate. You might find yourself a spectator, standing on the edge of the crowd, wondering if this was truly what Rome had come to. The air would be thick with incense, the sounds of foreign music, and the sight of the emperor in his flamboyant robes leading these exotic devotions. It was certainly a feast for the senses, if not for the soul of a traditional Roman. Elagabalus also declared himself the high priest of the cult, taking on the title Sacerdos Amplissimus Dei Solis Elagabali, the most eminent priest of the god Sol Elagabal. This cemented his dual role as both divine ruler and spiritual leader, blurring the lines between emperor and god in a way that was more typical of Eastern monarchies than of the Roman Republic or even the early empire. He often dressed in the traditional garb of an Emerson priest, complete with tall hats and painted eyes, further emphasizing his religious rather than his military or administrative authority. Imagine your president or prime minister walking around in elaborate ceremonial robes rather than a business suit. It would certainly make for an interesting press conference. This focus on religious reform came at the expense of traditional imperial duties. While Elagabalus was busy with his rituals and processions, the administrative functions of the empire largely fell to his shrewd grandmother, Julia Mesa, and his aunt, Julia Mamaia. They were the ones who actually ran the day-to-day affairs, appointed officials, and tried to maintain some semblance of order in a state increasingly bewildered by its young emperor. This division of labor, with the emperor focusing on spiritual matters and the women of his family handling secular governance, was another stark departure from Roman norms. It was a testament to his single-minded obsession with his god, even if it meant neglecting the vast, complex machinery of the Roman Empire. The impact of these religious changes reverberated through Roman society. While outright rebellion was suppressed, there was a growing undercurrent of unease. The Roman pantheon was deeply interwoven with the fabric of their identity, their history, their very notion of prosperity and protection. To see it so casually dismissed, even absorbed, by a foreign deity created a sense of instability. It felt like the very foundations of Rome were shifting. The Romans had always been pragmatic about adopting foreign gods, but this was different. This was not adoption, this was usurpation, a complete override of their sacred traditions. You could sense the quiet resentment building, simmering just beneath the surface of enforced compliance. This religious fervor, while perhaps genuine for Elagabalus, was proving to be one of the many reasons his reign would be remembered for its peculiarity and ultimately its brevity. So, you're in Rome, and the religious reforms are in full swing, turning the city's ancient spiritual landscape upside down. But Elagabalus's eccentricities weren't confined to the temples. Oh no, his imperial parties became the stuff of legend, whispered about in hushed tones, a source of both amusement and profound bewilderment. Imagine being invited to one of these banquets. You'd prepare yourself for an evening of Roman fine dining, perhaps some elegant music and dignified conversation. What you'd get, however, was a culinary and social roller coaster. He was obsessed with luxury and excess, but often in the strangest, most counterintuitive ways. Dinners would feature exotic, almost mythical ingredients. Forget your usual roasted, boar, or fine wine. You might be served dormice stuffed with nuts and honey, or perhaps a dish made from the tongues of nightingales. There are even reports of him serving guests dishes that looked like food but were actually made of glass or ivory just to mess with them. Imagine trying to cut into a perfectly sculpted roast chicken only to find it's a solid piece of marble. It's the kind of prank that's funny for exactly 2 seconds, then just deeply irritating. He also enjoyed serving guests food made of incredibly rare and expensive ingredients, only to then serve himself something incredibly cheap, like lentils, just to make a point, or perhaps just to be difficult. But the food was just the beginning. The ambiance was equally peculiar. He would arrange his banquets so that guests reclined on cushions stuffed with unusual materials, not just down feathers, but sometimes straw, or even, famously, saffron, which probably left everyone smelling wonderfully spicy for weeks. And the seating arrangements. Forget social hierarchy. He'd assign guests positions at tables based on their weight, or perhaps their hair color, or even the size of their feet. You might find yourself seated next to a complete stranger, wondering what strange metric had brought you together. It was less about status and more about a bizarre imperial game of chance. Historians still debate whether these antics were simply the result of an utterly uninhibited mind or if there was a deliberate, subversive intent behind these bizarre displays, aiming to mock Roman social conventions. Elagabalus loved to surprise, and not always in a pleasant way. At one banquet, he reportedly released lions and leopards, all declawed and defanged, among his terrified guests. While harmless, the sheer terror of wild beasts roaming around your dinner party would certainly make for an unforgettable evening. You'd probably spend the rest of the night checking under your couch for stray paws. Another time, he would release vast quantities of flowers from the ceiling, so many that some guests were reportedly suffocated by the sheer volume of petals. It sounds beautiful, almost poetic, but imagine being buried under a mountain of roses. It's like being engulfed in a giant, fragrant, fluffy avalanche. His generosity, too, was often tied to an element of chaos. He would throw gold and silver coins from the palace windows to the crowds below, but not in a neat, orderly fashion. It was a scramble, a free-for-all, designed to create a spectacle of desperate grabbing and fighting. He also had a habit of giving away ludicrously large and extravagant gifts to his favored companions, like entire villas or vast sums of money, only to then demand them back the next day. It was a game of cat and mouse, designed to keep everyone on edge, constantly trying to guess the emperor's capricious whims. You'd be thrilled to receive a new house, only to have a sinking feeling knowing it might be repossessed by lunchtime tomorrow. Even his personal staff and companions were chosen for their novelty rather than their competence. He surrounded himself with charioteers, actors, and dancers, rather than seasoned administrators or military commanders. His closest confidants were often drawn from the lowest ranks of society, elevated to positions of immense power overnight. This further alienated him from the traditional Roman aristocracy, who saw their rightful place usurped by those they considered beneath them. It was a clear signal that the old order was truly being overturned, and that merit, as the Romans understood it, was no longer a prerequisite for imperial favor. These parties, these daily spectacles of excess and oddity, served to further isolate Elagabalus from the traditional Roman establishment. The senators, the old families, the military leaders, they found themselves increasingly uncomfortable, bewildered, and quietly outraged by the emperor's antics. This wasn't just about bad taste. It was about a fundamental disrespect for Roman values, for their sense of order and propriety. While some might have found his antics amusing for a time, the sheer unpredictability and the constant subversion of norms began to wear thin. You'd find yourself hoping for a quiet night in, far away from the emperor's latest bizarre pronouncements. The laughter, if any, that escaped these gatherings was likely nervous, forced, and fleeting, a stark contrast to the genuine mirth that would soon become a forbidden luxury. The empire was slowly but surely holding its breath, awaiting the next peculiar turn from its baffling young ruler. You're deep in the heart of Elagabalus's Rome, witnessing the constant stream of strange spectacles. But beyond the banquets and religious overhauls, his approach to personal relationships, particularly marriages and gender, was perhaps the most shocking and profoundly destabilizing to Roman society. He seemed to delight in openly defying every single Roman norm, not just for the sake of defiance, but almost as a performative art designed to provoke and bewilder. Romans had strict expectations for marriage, particularly for emperors. It was a matter of state, of alliances, and of producing legitimate heirs. Elagabalus, however, treated it like a bizarre game of musical chairs. His most infamous marriage was to Aquilia Severa, a Vestal virgin. Now, you might recall that Vestal virgins were highly respected priestesses dedicated to the goddess Vesta and sworn to chastity. Breaking their vows carried the death penalty, being buried alive. For an emperor to marry one was an act of profound sacrilege, shaking the very foundations of Roman religious and social order. He claimed it was to produce godlike children, a union of divine power. But to the Romans, it was an outrageous affront. Imagine the sheer audacity, the emperor literally breaking the law and spiritual tenets of the empire, all for a whim. It's like your head of state casually robbing a bank and claiming it's for a spiritual quest. Historians still argue whether this was an act of genuine religious belief or a calculated move to further intertwine his cult with Roman traditions in the most shocking way possible. But the Vestal Virgin wasn't his only spouse. He had a rapid succession of marriages, often divorcing one wife and taking another within weeks, a level of marital instability that was deeply unsettling for a culture that valued stability in its leaders. He married and divorced at least 5 women, including a brief reconciliation with his first wife, Julia Paula. This was not the dignified, patriarchal head of state Rome expected. This was a capricious, almost childish figure, treating matters of profound social and political significance as mere trifles. You'd be struggling to keep track of who the Empress du jour actually was. Then, there's the aspect of his gender expression, which was truly groundbreaking and deeply unsettling to his contemporaries. Roman society was rigidly patriarchal, with strict definitions of masculinity and femininity. An emperor was the embodiment of Roman virility, strength, and order. Elagabalus, however, openly challenged these norms. He was frequently seen wearing women's clothing, particularly luxurious silk robes and makeup, which was unheard of for a Roman man, let alone an emperor. He reportedly preferred to be called mistress rather than master, and was said to have walked with a distinctly feminine gait. Imagine your commander-in-chief parading around in a ball gown. It would certainly get people talking, and not in a good way, for the conservative Roman elite. Even more shocking to the Roman mindset were his relationships with men. He openly had male lovers, which, while not entirely uncommon in Roman society, was certainly not something an emperor flaunted publicly, let alone established formal marriages with. He reportedly married a charioteer named Heracles, referring to him as his husband and lavishing him with imperial honors and wealth. There are accounts, albeit from hostile sources, that he offered vast sums of money to any physician who could perform a sex change operation on him. So desperate was he to align his physical body with his internal sense of self. This was a profound and radical challenge to Roman societal norms, a direct subversion of the very identity of what it meant to be a Roman emperor. You'd be grappling with concepts that your society simply didn't have the framework to understand or accept. This open defiance of gender norms was not merely a personal preference, it was seen as a sign of degeneracy, a fundamental weakness that threatened the strength and virility of the empire itself. For a Roman, such behavior in their emperor was not just scandalous, it was a bad omen, a sign that the natural order of things was being subverted and that chaos might follow. The army, in particular, which relied on a strong, masculine image of its leader, would have been deeply disturbed. You can imagine the soldiers, tough and traditional, scratching their heads, wondering if their emperor was fit to lead them into battle, or if he was more interested in selecting his next elaborate outfit. His bizarre marriage practices and gender expression were not just personal quirks, they were deeply political. They alienated the Senate, the military, and the conservative elements of Roman society. They undermined the traditional foundations of imperial authority and fueled the growing discontent. While some might have found his modernity or open mindedness intriguing in retrospect, for the Romans of the 3rd century AD, it was an unsettling, almost frightening display of imperial power untethered from tradition and expectation. It felt like the world was truly turning upside down. And for a society that prized order and hierarchy, this was a profound cause for concern. The emperor who tried to ban laughter was also an emperor who tried to ban, or at least profoundly redefine, the very notion of what it meant to be Roman. You're deep in the bewildering world of Elagabalus's Rome, where even the simplest public appearances became extraordinary spectacles. His love for the bizarre wasn't limited to private parties. It spilled onto the streets, transforming ordinary imperial processions into grand theatrical events that further baffled and alienated the Roman populace. Imagine a standard Roman imperial parade, the emperor, stoic and dignified, in a chariot, surrounded by legions, embodying strength and order. Now, erase that image from your mind, because Elagabalus had a very different vision. When he made a public appearance, it was rarely in a conventional manner. One of his most famous eccentricities was driving chariots pulled by unusual animals. Forget horses. Elagabalus preferred camels, elephants, or even, according to some accounts, harnessed women, while the latter is likely an exaggeration by hostile historians seeking to discredit him. The use of exotic animals was certainly real. You'd be standing by the roadside, expecting the familiar sight of chargers, and instead, a procession of camels draped in silks and jewels would clop past, carrying the emperor. It must have been quite the sight, perhaps generating more head scratching than awe. It was less about military might and more about a curious, almost whimsical display of imperial power designed to amuse himself as much as to impress his subjects. He also had a peculiar fondness for collecting animals, not just for circuses or gladiator games, but for his personal menagerie. He reportedly kept lions that were tame enough to be allowed into his dining room. You'd be at a dinner party, trying to make polite conversation, and there's a fully grown lion casually napping by the wine amphora. It certainly adds a certain je ne sais quoi to an evening, wouldn't it? He'd also gather exotic birds, and at his banquets, sometimes live birds would be released into the dining hall, fluttering among the terrified guests. Imagine trying to eat your roasted pheasant while a live parrot is trying to perch on your head. It's certainly a memorable dining experience, though perhaps not for the right reasons. His generosity, too, was often tied to an element of chaos and humiliation. He was known for scattering large quantities of gold and silver coins, not just to the poor, but indiscriminately, causing riots and scrambles among the crowds. But he also had a penchant for giving unusual gifts. At one point, he reputedly gave away entire ships to his friends, filled not with cargo, but with provisions for a sea journey, complete with a crew, only to then leave them stranded miles from shore. Or he might send gifts of dead animals, or even live snakes, just to elicit a reaction. Imagine receiving a beautifully wrapped box only to open it and find a hissing serpent inside. It's the kind of thing that makes you question your friendship choices. Historians still argue whether these were genuine acts of cruel humor or simply the result of an utterly detached and unconventional mind. Elagabalus also had a fascination with peculiar games and contests. He would organize races with chariots pulled by dogs or even by ostriches, which, as you can imagine, were probably more comical than competitive. He'd also participate in various athletic contests, often wearing unusual attire. His involvement in these events was less about demonstrating physical prowess and more about creating a spectacle. You'd be watching a race, and the emperor is there, not in athletic gear, but perhaps in a shimmering silk tunic, cheering on his ostrich-drawn chariot. It certainly brought a new meaning to the term Imperial Games. His personal hygiene, or lack thereof from a Roman perspective, was also a subject of gossip. He reportedly washed in public baths with women, which was a significant breach of Roman social etiquette, as men and women typically bathed separately. He also used elaborate cosmetics and perfumes, going far beyond what was considered acceptable for a Roman man, especially an emperor. This further contributed to the perception that he was effeminate and un-Roman, fueling the outrage of the traditional elite. You'd think, surely the emperor knows better? But no, he seemed to relish defying these expectations. These public appearances, often theatrical and provocative, constantly reminded the Roman populace that their emperor was unlike any they had ever seen. They were a continuous source of bewilderment, amusement, and ultimately growing resentment. The constant barrage of unconventional behavior, from his religious reforms to his gender expression, from his bizarre parties to his eccentric public displays, was chipping away at the Romans' patience. The dignity of the imperial office was being systematically dismantled, replaced by something outlandish and unpredictable. You could feel the tension in the air, sense that something had to give. The city, which was once a beacon of order and stability, was becoming a stage for the emperor's unending performance art. And for those who craved a sense of normalcy, this constant disruption was becoming unbearable. It was against this backdrop of perpetual oddity that the most peculiar of his decrees would eventually emerge: the attempt to silence the very sound of joy. You've witnessed the bizarre religious reforms, the outlandish parties, the gender bending attire, and the chaotic public appearances. It's clear that Elagabalus was an emperor who reveled in defying expectations. But amidst all these eccentricities, one of his most baffling and, frankly, unnerving policies was his purported attempt to ban laughter. Yes, laughter, that spontaneous, joyous expression that bubbles up from within. Imagine a world where that sound, that very human response, was deemed unwelcome, perhaps even illegal, within the imperial city. Now, it's important to note that the historical accounts of this ban on laughter are often intertwined with other anecdotes about Elagabalus's reign, many of which were written by Roman historians who were openly hostile to him. They painted him as a depraved, effeminate, and utterly unfit ruler. So, some exaggeration for dramatic effect was certainly at play. However, the consistent theme of his discomfort with unbridled joy and his preference for a more subdued, controlled atmosphere suggests there's a kernel of truth to the stories. It wasn't a formal edict posted on every street corner, perhaps, but rather a pervasive imperial attitude that subtly, yet effectively, suppressed public mirth. So, how does one even attempt to ban laughter? You can't exactly outlaw a physiological reaction, can you? It wasn't a literal decree stating, "Thou shalt not laugh." Instead, it manifested as a pervasive atmosphere of solemnity and a subtle but clear discouragement of joy, particularly in public spaces or during imperial functions. Imagine being at a formal gathering, or even just walking through the forum, and you sense this unspoken rule. People are quiet, their faces serious. A spontaneous chuckle might elicit a nervous glance from your neighbor, a subtle shush, or even a stern look from a passing imperial guard. It's the kind of social pressure that makes you self-conscious of every stray smile, every twitch of your lips. One theory suggests that Elagabalus, deeply immersed in his foreign religious cult, viewed excessive public merriment as undignified or even disrespectful to his serious and demanding sun god. His god, Elagabal, was a stern deity, not one for frivolous displays. If the emperor was the high priest of this god, then his court, and by extension, the entire city, should reflect that piety and solemnity. It was a projection of his own intense religious conviction onto the entire populace, transforming Rome into a silent, reverent congregation. This perspective aligns with his desire for an almost monastic devotion to his deity, where worldly pleasures and loud expressions of joy might be seen as distractions from spiritual focus. Another theory posits that his discomfort with laughter stemmed from a deeper psychological insecurity, or perhaps a touch of megalomania. Laughter, particularly spontaneous, unforced laughter, implies a certain freedom, a lack of fear, and a shared connection among people. For an emperor who demanded absolute control and reverence, this uninhibited expression might have felt like a challenge to his authority, a sign that people weren't taking him or his reign seriously enough. If people were laughing, it meant they weren't entirely focused on him, or worse, they might be laughing at him. It's the kind of paranoid thinking that absolute power can breed. Historians still argue whether his strange behaviors were driven by genuine religious zeal, calculated political strategy, or simply the unchecked whims of a bizarre and unstable youth. Imagine this practical application. You're a Roman citizen, perhaps a merchant, trying to hawk your wares in the marketplace. Normally, there's banter, jokes, the lively hum of human interaction. But now, the laughter is gone. Instead, you hear hushed conversations, the clinking of coins, the shuffling of feet. The vibrant energy of the forum is replaced by an almost unnerving quiet. You might suppress a chuckle at a friend's witty remark, turning it into a silent, internal smirk, lest you draw unwanted attention. The air itself feels heavy with unspoken restraint. It's not about punishment for every chuckle, but about creating an environment where laughter simply doesn't feel safe or appropriate. This subtle suppression would have been particularly effective in official settings, at imperial banquets, where normally witty remarks and boisterous conversations would flow. The atmosphere would be tense, the guests carefully choosing their words and expressions. A slip of the tongue, a sudden guffaw, could be seen as a grave offense. Imagine the awkward silences, the strained smiles, as everyone tries to maintain a facade of solemnity. It's the ultimate dinner party buzzkill. The lack of genuine mirth would have made these events even more alienating for the Roman elite, adding another layer of discomfort to their already strained relationship with the bizarre emperor. The Roman Empire, once known for its lively public life and its appreciation for satire and comedy, was slowly being transformed into a place where joy was actively discouraged, leaving a peculiar silence in its wake. So, you're a Roman citizen trying to go about your daily life in a city where laughter is subtly yet palpably discouraged. How do you adapt? It's not like you can just flip a switch and turn off your sense of humor. Daily life under Elagabalus, particularly with this undercurrent of suppressed mirth, would have required a constant, low level vigilance, a kind of internal censor always at work. Imagine a typical morning. You wake up. Perhaps you hear a funny story from your spouse or a playful comment from a child. Your natural reaction might be a chuckle, a smile that spreads into a laugh. But now, you instinctively check yourself. Was it too loud? Did anyone hear? You might turn your laughter into a silent shake of the shoulders, a suppressed grin, or perhaps a quick, almost apologetic cough. It's a subtle but profound shift in human interaction. The very air you breathe feels different, tinged with a quiet tension, a silent question mark hanging over every potential moment of joy. This extended beyond personal interactions. Think about public spaces. The Roman Forum, usually a buzzing hub of activity, filled with the shouts of vendors, the debates of politicians, and the general cacophony of a thriving city would have taken on a more subdued character. The street performers, the jesters, the satirists, their livelihoods would have been significantly impacted. Who would risk a boisterous laugh at a comedy show if it meant attracting unwanted attention from an imperial guard? You might find yourself observing more, participating less, keeping your expressions neutral, your demeanor serious. It's almost like everyone is constantly playing a low stakes game of charades, trying to convey emotion without sound. Even children, naturally effervescent and prone to spontaneous bursts of giggles, would have been subtly, or not so subtly, trained to suppress their mirth. Parents would shush them, perhaps with a nervous glance over their shoulders, reminding them that some things are best kept quiet. Imagine a Roman mother trying to explain to her child why it's safer not to laugh too loudly. It's a grim lesson, isn't it? A society that discourages the innocent joy of its children is a society under considerable strain. Historians still argue whether this societal shift was due to direct punitive measures or simply an overwhelming atmosphere of fear and caution. It was likely a combination, with the perception of risk being enough to enforce conformity. Consider the ripple effect on social gatherings. What were once lively dinner parties or convivial meetings of friends would transform into more restrained affairs. The witty repartee might still exist, but the accompanying bursts of laughter would be muted, perhaps replaced by knowing glances or soft murmurs of amusement. The collective release that laughter provides, the bonding experience of shared joy, would be severely curtailed. It would feel less like a celebration and more like a polite, somewhat stiff obligation. You'd be constantly aware of the presence of others, wondering if your own suppressed mirth was visible, or if someone else's quiet chuckle might inadvertently draw attention. The ban, or discouragement, also extended to performances. Roman theater, while it had serious dramas, also had comedies and satires. How do actors perform comedy to an audience afraid to laugh? They might rely more on visual gags, on subtle facial expressions, or on humor that elicits a quiet smile rather than a hearty guffaw. The audience, in turn, would become experts in silent appreciation, their enjoyment communicated through a shared, unspoken understanding rather than an audible response. It's a peculiar way to consume entertainment, requiring a kind of disciplined appreciation. Even simple daily interactions, like negotiating a price in the market or greeting a friend, would have lost some of their natural ease. The lightheartedness that often accompanies these exchanges would be replaced by a more formal, guarded tone. It's the psychological burden of constantly monitoring your own impulses, of always being aware that a natural human reaction could be misinterpreted or even punished. This pervasive atmosphere of quietude would have been exhausting, a constant drain on the collective spirit of the city. You'd find yourself longing for the days when a simple, uninhibited laugh wasn't something to be feared or suppressed. The silence, or rather, the lack of natural sound, would have been deafening in its own way, a constant reminder of the strange, unsettling reign of Elagabalus. You are navigating the hushed streets of Rome, subtly suppressing your natural inclinations for a chuckle. But imagine being a Roman senator during Elagabalus's reign. Your life once filled with dignified debates, strategic alliances, and the quiet exercise of power, would now be a minefield of awkward compliance and quiet, desperate defiance. The ban on laughter, subtle as it was, would have amplified every other absurdity of the emperor's rule, pushing the patience of the elite to its breaking point. Senators were the backbone of Rome, the traditional guardians of its laws, customs, and dignity. They were the ones who had to publicly kowtow to a teenage emperor who flouted every tradition they held dear. Imagine sitting in the Senate House, trying to maintain a straight face, as Elagabalus, perhaps in his peculiar robes, presented another outlandish decree. You'd be forced to nod in agreement, to offer polite applause, all the while internally seething. It's like being forced to attend a nonsensical play every day and pretend it's the most profound drama you've ever seen. The pressure to conform was immense. A senator caught laughing or even smiling too broadly in the presence of the emperor or his inner circle could face severe consequences. It might not be immediate execution, but it could mean public humiliation, confiscation of property, or banishment. Careers, fortunes, and reputations were at stake. So, they perfected the art of the strained smile, the polite nod, the barely perceptible frown. They learned to communicate their disapproval through silent glances, through the subtle shifting of their weight, through the almost imperceptible tightening of their lips. It was a silent language of dissent, understood by all, but spoken by none. Historians still argue whether the Senate's compliance was a testament to the absolute power of the emperor or a strategic waiting game, hoping Elagabalus would eventually overstep so badly that his downfall would be inevitable. Perhaps it was a mix of both. They were undoubtedly afraid, but they were also proud and deeply resentful of the constant indignities heaped upon them. You can almost feel the simmering rage beneath their composed exteriors. They were forced to endure his bizarre parties, to participate in his strange religious ceremonies, and now to suppress their very human urge for joy. It was a death by 1,000 cuts to their dignity. Consider the daily routine of a senator. You might be discussing important state matters, like grain supplies or troop movements, but always with one eye on the emperor's latest whim. One day, Elagabalus might demand that all senators wear a specific type of sandal. The next, he might insist they adopt a new hairstyle. These seemingly minor decrees, coupled with the larger affronts to tradition, chipped away at their authority and sense of self. It was a constant reminder that their power was conditional and entirely dependent on the erratic moods of a boy emperor. It's the kind of bureaucratic absurdity that would make even the most seasoned diplomat want to bang his head against a marble pillar. The senators also had to contend with the emperor's bizarre appointments. Elagabalus famously appointed men to high office based on their looks or their skills as charioteers, or even their ability to eat large quantities of food, rather than their administrative experience or noble birth. This was an insult to the traditional cursus honorum, the established path of honors and offices that Roman aristocrats followed. Imagine a distinguished senator who has spent decades working his way up the ranks, suddenly finding himself taking orders from a former stable boy. It was a direct challenge to the very idea of meritocracy that, however imperfectly, governed Roman public life. This constant erosion of norms and the imposition of absurdities, including the suppression of laughter, created an environment of deep anxiety and paranoia among the senatorial class. They lived in a state of perpetual uncertainty, never knowing what new outrage the next day would bring. The subtle pressure to remain solemn, to never show a sign of amusement at the emperor's antics, added an extra layer of stress to their already precarious existence. It forced them to become masters of their own expressions, carefully schooling their faces to betray no hint of genuine emotion. You'd constantly feel like you were walking on thin ice, every interaction a potential misstep. This quiet suffering of the Roman elite would eventually play a significant role in the unraveling of Elagabalus's short but tumultuous reign. The silence they were forced to keep was building into a deafening roar of discontent. You're experiencing the subtle pressure of the laughter ban, feeling the weight of forced solemnity. But how exactly does an emperor enforce such a bizarre notion across an entire city, let alone an empire? This is where the imperial enforcers come in, those who would subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, guard the silence. It wasn't a visible police force solely dedicated to suppressing giggles, but rather the existing infrastructure of imperial power, subtly repurposed to monitor and manage public demeanor. The Praetorian Guard, the elite protectors of the emperor, would have played a significant, if understated, role. While their primary duty was to protect Elagabalus, their presence alone would have been a powerful deterrent. Imagine them, stern-faced and heavily armed, patrolling the forum or standing impassively at public events. A single, disapproving glance from one of these formidable soldiers would be enough to quell any nascent chuckle. You'd probably instinctively straighten up, wipe that smile off your face, and adopt a more serious expression. Their silent vigilance created an atmosphere where caution became second nature. Historians still argue about the extent to which the Praetorian Guard, initially loyal to the Severan dynasty, truly supported Elagabalus's eccentricities, but their duty compelled them to enforce his will, however strange. Beyond the Praetorians, there were the countless imperial servants, informants, and local magistrates who would have been implicitly, if not explicitly, tasked with maintaining decorum. A Roman citizen, casually jesting with a friend, might find themselves quietly reported by a nosy neighbor or a minor official looking to curry favor. It wasn't about mass arrests for laughter. It was about creating a climate of apprehension where the risk of being noticed for exhibiting forbidden joy was just high enough to encourage self-censorship. It's like living in a strict household where you know your parents dislike loud noises, so you learn to whisper your jokes. The methods weren't always direct. Sometimes it was about selective enforcement. If a senator or a high-ranking citizen was seen exhibiting too much mirth in the emperor's presence, they might not be immediately punished for the laughter itself. Instead, they might find their requests denied, their petitions ignored, or their social standing subtly diminished. Their properties might be inspected for irregularities, or their loyalties questioned. It was a form of soft power, a chilling effect that ensured compliance without the need for grand pronouncements. You'd quickly learn that the path to imperial Favor was paved with solemnity, not smiles. Furthermore, the emperor's personal retinue and his inner circle would have mirrored his preferred demeanor. If Elagabalus himself was serious in public, then his courtiers would be even more so. Imagine trying to make a joke to a courtier who fears that even a slight twitch of his lips might be reported back to the emperor. The entire court would become a somber, almost humorless place where every interaction was carefully weighed for its potential to offend. This internal policing within the imperial bubble would then radiate outwards, setting the tone for the rest of the city. The very design of imperial events would contribute to this atmosphere. The grand religious processions, the solemn sacrifices, the formal banquets, they were all choreographed to emphasize gravity and reverence. There was little room for spontaneous outbursts of joy. The music would be stately, the movements deliberate, the speeches formal. Any sudden burst of laughter would shatter the carefully constructed solemnity, making the offender stand out in a stark and unwelcome way. You'd be expected to be an observer, not a participant in joy. This extended even to artistic expressions. Roman art and literature, particularly satire, had a long tradition of humor. Under Elagabalus, however, the public display of such works might have been curtailed, or artists might have self-censored, knowing that light-heartedness could be misinterpreted as disrespect. The public mood would shift, becoming more reserved, more guarded. The collective psyche of the city would internalize this unspoken rule, leading to a subtle dampening of spirits that was perhaps more effective than any direct ban. So, while you wouldn't see laughter police patrolling the streets, the combination of the formidable Praetorian Guard, the network of informants, the subtle yet severe consequences for stepping out of line, and the pervasive atmosphere of solemnity at imperial events all contributed to a city where genuine, uninhibited laughter became a rare and risky indulgence. The silence wasn't enforced by decree alone, but by a chilling, pervasive sense of caution that permeated every aspect of Roman daily life under its peculiar emperor. You're navigating the quiet, cautious world of Elagabalus's Rome, where even a slight smile can feel like a transgression. But what happened if you did slip up? What were the peculiar punishments for audible mirth or for any perceived defiance of the emperor's increasingly strange expectations? While there might not have been a specific giggle penalty on the imperial books, the consequences for displeasing Elagabalus were often arbitrary, bizarre, and designed more for his amusement or to assert his absolute power than for any logical justice. Consider the case of a senator who was, perhaps, unable to stifle a chuckle at one of Elagabalus's more outlandish pronouncements or at his flamboyant attire. The emperor might not order an immediate execution. Instead, the punishment could be far more humiliating. He might order the senator to wear women's clothing for a public event or to perform a demeaning dance in front of the court. Imagine the utter mortification for a proud Roman aristocrat. It was a form of psychological torture designed to break their spirit and make them a public spectacle of the emperor's absolute authority. This was a common tactic, not brutal physical violence, but a more insidious, reputation shattering. Humiliation. Historians still argue whether these punishments were truly a result of a sadistic streak or simply the actions of a youth utterly devoid of empathy and understanding of social norms. Beyond public humiliation, financial penalties were common. A person caught exhibiting too much levity or otherwise displeasing the emperor might find their property confiscated or be forced to pay exorbitant fines. This was a convenient way for Elagabalus to refill his coffers, which were often depleted by his lavish and eccentric spending habits. Imagine making a joke and then finding your vineyard suddenly declared imperial property. It would certainly make you think twice about your next witticism. These confiscations often happened without due process, highlighting the arbitrary nature of his rule. You'd wake up one morning and suddenly your livelihood is gone, all because you perhaps laughed a little too loudly at a bad play the emperor wrote. Banishment was another favored punishment. If a high ranking official or a member of the elite persistently displeased Elagabalus, they might be exiled to a remote part of the empire, stripped of their titles and wealth. This was a particularly harsh penalty for Romans, whose identity was so closely tied to their city, their family, and their social standing. To be cast out, far from the familiar comforts of Rome, was a fate worse than death for many. You'd be looking at a map, trying to figure out where the ends of the earth were, knowing that's where you'd likely spend the rest of your days, all because you had the audacity to exhibit a moment of unbridled joy. There were also the more subtle, but equally effective, forms of punishment. Disfavor meant being excluded from court, losing access to influential networks, and seeing your career stagnate. For ambitious Romans, this was a powerful deterrent. You might not face a direct punishment, but you'd find doors closed, opportunities vanished, and your influence completely eroded. It was a slow, agonizing decline, designed to make an example of anyone who dared to step out of line, however subtly. And then there were the truly bizarre stories, often exaggerated, but indicative of the atmosphere of fear and capriciousness. Tales of Elagabalus inviting guests to dinner only to surprise them with a release of wild, declawed animals, as mentioned before, or serving them poisoned food, though this is more likely slander. While these specific tales might be apocryphal, they illustrate the common perception of an emperor whose idea of a good time was often terrifying for his subjects. The fear wasn't just of death, but of unpredictable, humiliating, and utterly senseless torment. The capricious nature of these punishments meant that no one was truly safe, and no one knew what might offend the emperor next. This uncertainty was perhaps the cruelest punishment of all, forcing everyone to live in a state of constant anxiety. The emphasis was not on justice or established law, but on the emperor's mercurial whims. You might follow all the rules, suppress every chuckle, maintain a perfectly solemn expression, and still find yourself in hot water simply because the emperor was having a bad day, or because he found your very existence mildly irritating. The peculiar punishments for peculiar crimes reinforced the notion that under Elagabalus, Rome had become a stage for his unpredictable and often cruel performance. You've been living in a city where genuine laughter is suppressed, where bizarre punishments are meted out for imagined slights, and where the emperor's whims dictate everything. It's no surprise that, despite Elagabalus's absolute power, a deep undercurrent of discontent was steadily growing throughout the Roman Empire. This wasn't a sudden uprising, but a slow, simmering rebellion born of exhaustion and outrage. The first group to truly feel the strain was the Praetorian Guard themselves. While they were the emperor's personal protectors and enforcers, their loyalty wasn't unconditional. They were soldiers, men who valued discipline, strength, and a clear chain of command. Elagabalus's effeminate behavior, his obsession with foreign rituals over military matters, and his elevation of charioteers and dancers to positions of power deeply offended their military sensibilities. Imagine being a tough, seasoned guard, sworn to protect a man who prefers wearing silk dresses and demanding sex change operations to leading legions. It's hard to maintain respect, let alone loyalty, under those circumstances. They watched as the emperor squandered resources, neglected military readiness, and generally brought what they perceived as shame upon the imperial office. Historians still argue about the exact tipping point for the Praetorians, but it's clear their patience wore thin. Then there was the Senate. As you've seen, they were forced to endure public humiliations, witness the desecration of their traditions, and constantly suppress their own disdain. Their quiet resentment was a powerful force. While they couldn't openly defy the emperor, they possessed immense influence and networks. They quietly spread whispers, fostered discontent, and waited for their moment. They were the ones who truly understood the long-term damage Elagabalus was doing to the prestige and stability of the Roman state. The laughter ban, while perhaps not the sole cause, was yet another absurd imposition that highlighted the emperor's complete disregard for their dignity. The Roman populace, too, grew weary. While some might have initially found Elagabalus's eccentricities amusing, the novelty quickly wore off. The constant disruption, the arbitrary rule, the perceived disrespect for their gods and customs, and the overall air of strangeness began to take its toll. Life under Elagabalus was simply too unpredictable, too unsettling. The economy, too, suffered from his lavish spending and disregard for sound administration, leading to inflation and hardship for many. When people are struggling to put food on the table, an emperor parading around in exotic costumes and banning laughter quickly loses his charm. You'd find yourself longing for the days of boring, predictable emperors. Crucially, Elagabalus had an incredibly shrewd and politically savvy grandmother, Julia Mesa, and aunt, Julia Mamea. They were the architects of his rise to power, and they quickly realized that their puppet emperor was spiraling out of control, threatening not just his own reign, but the entire Severan dynasty they had worked so hard to preserve. They tried to rein him in, to advise him to adopt more conventional Roman behavior. But Elagabalus was either too stubborn, too arrogant, or too consumed by his own bizarre vision to listen. It's almost like watching a child play with matches, knowing the whole house is about to go up in flames. Julia Mesa, ever the pragmatist, understood that a replacement was needed. She began to discreetly promote her other grandson, Elagabalus's cousin, Alexianus, who was a far more traditional, sensible, and appealing candidate to the Roman establishment. She groomed him, presented him as a suitable heir, and carefully fostered loyalty towards him among the Praetorian Guard and the Senate. This was a dangerous game, requiring immense subtlety and careful maneuvering, as Elagabalus himself was fiercely possessive of his power. The growing discontent finally crystallized around the figure of Alexianus, later known as Severus Alexander. He represented everything Elagabalus was not: a return to Roman values, military discipline, and traditional piety. The stage was set for a power struggle, not a battle on a distant frontier, but a quiet, insidious battle for the hearts and minds of the Roman power structure. The strange, silent reign of Elagabalus was reaching its inevitable, tumultuous conclusion. The empire, having held its breath for too long, was about to exhale, and it wouldn't be a sigh of relief, but a roar of rejection. You've seen the discontent simmering, the patience of Rome wearing thin. The grand political chessboard was set, and the pieces were moving. On one side, the increasingly isolated and bizarre Elagabalus, clinging to his sun god and his unconventional ways. On the other, his shrewd grandmother, Julia Mesa, carefully cultivating the image of his cousin, Alexianus, as the sensible alternative. The end of Elagabalus's strange reign was not a question of if, but when and how. The breaking point arrived in March of 222 OBD. Julia Mesa, with her characteristic political acumen, had managed to convince Elagabalus to adopt Alexianus as his heir and grant him the title of Caesar, effectively making him junior emperor. This was a tactical masterpiece on Mesa's part, as it publicly legitimized Alexianus and gave him a formal role, allowing him to build a following within the Praetorian Guard. Elagabalus, perhaps seeing his cousin as a threat to his absolute power, soon regretted this decision. He tried to strip Alexianus of his titles, but by then it was too late. The Praetorians, who had grown utterly fed up with Elagabalus's antics, had firmly thrown their lot in with the more traditional and promising Alexianus. Imagine the tension in the Praetorian camp. These were the elite soldiers, the ones who could make or break an emperor. They had endured the bizarre religious ceremonies, the effeminate behavior, and the constant disregard for military tradition. The laughter ban, while a minor point in comparison to the larger issues, was just another symbol of an emperor who had completely lost touch with the realities of governing. They had a clear choice: continue to serve a bizarre, unpredictable ruler who was undermining the very fabric of Rome, or back a younger, more stable candidate who promised a return to order. It was a no-brainer for most of them. On March 11th, 222 AD, Elagabalus, still only 18 years old, made a fateful error. He ordered the Praetorian Guard to arrest Alexianus and execute the loyalists who supported him. But the guard refused. Instead, they seized Elagabalus himself. What followed was a brutal, swift end to a reign that had bewildered an empire. You can almost hear the shouts, the clash of steel, the desperate cries within the imperial palace. This wasn't a slow, dignified overthrow. It was a violent purge. Elagabalus, along with his mother, Julia Soamias, who had been a strong supporter of his eccentricities, was dragged from the palace. Accounts vary, but the most dramatic suggest he tried to hide in a chest or a privy, only to be discovered. He was summarily executed by the praetorians, often depicted as a particularly undignified and violent death, befitting their disdain for him. His body was then dragged through the streets of Rome, a public spectacle of humiliation. It was eventually thrown into the Tiber River, a final, symbolic act of rejection by the city he had so thoroughly alienated. This act of public desecration was highly unusual for a deceased emperor, even an unpopular one, demonstrating the depth of contempt the Praetorians and perhaps the populace felt for him. Historians still argue about the precise details of his death, but the outcome is clear. His reign was over. The aftermath was swift. Alexianus was immediately proclaimed emperor, taking the name Severus Alexander. He was the antithesis of Elagabalus, serious, respectful of Roman traditions, and interested in sound governance and military affairs. His reign ushered in a period of relative stability, a collective sigh of relief from an empire that had been on the edge of its seat for 4 tumultuous years. The black stone of Elagabal, which had been elevated to supreme deity, was removed from its temple and sent back to Emesa, its cult dismantled, and Roman religious practices restored to their traditional place. All records and symbols of Elagabalus's reign were systematically destroyed or removed in a process known as damnatio memoriae, an attempt to erase him from history. It was as if Rome wanted to collectively forget the strange, uncomfortable period where laughter was frowned upon and the emperor danced for a foreign god. The fall of Elagabalus wasn't just the end of an emperor, it was the end of a bizarre experiment in imperial rule, a clear rejection of a ruler who pushed the boundaries of Roman patience too far. The silence he had tried to enforce, the peculiar nature of his demands, and his fundamental disrespect for tradition ultimately sealed his fate. The Roman Empire, having endured a period of profound strangeness, was ready for a return to normalcy, to the predictable, and perhaps even to the occasional, uninhibited laugh. The curtains had fallen on the most peculiar act in Roman imperial history. You've witnessed the bizarre rise and the violent fall of Elagabalus, an emperor who, for a brief, bewildering time, tried to ban laughter from Rome. Now, as the dust settles and the more traditional Severus Alexander takes the throne, you might wonder, how does history remember such a strange figure? What is the legacy of laughter in a reign designed to silence it? The immediate aftermath of Elagabalus's death was a thorough and systematic attempt to erase him from history. This was known as damnatio memoriae, a practice where Roman authorities would condemn a disgraced person's memory, removing their name from inscriptions, destroying their statues, and essentially pretending they never existed. So, for a time, Rome tried to collectively forget the emperor who loved outlandish parties and hated joy. You'd see his name chipped off monuments, his portraits defaced. It was Rome's way of saying, that never happened. We don't talk about Bruno, I mean Elagabalus. This immediate historical judgment was harsh and absolute, a clear signal that his reign was considered an aberration, a period of profound embarrassment for the proud Roman state. However, despite the damnatio memoriae, Elagabalus's story, with all its peculiar details, persisted. Later historians, often drawing from accounts written by those hostile to him, solidified his reputation as one of Rome's most eccentric and scandalous emperors. He became a cautionary tale, a vivid example of what happens when unchecked power falls into the hands of an unstable, unconventional youth. His reign is often characterized by decadence, religious fanaticism, and a complete disregard for Roman norms. This is the mainstream historical fact about him. He was an anomaly, a blot on the imperial record. Yet, as time passed and scholarship evolved, a more nuanced understanding began to emerge. While his eccentricities are undeniable, modern historians grapple with the question of why. Was he truly a mad despot, or was he a deeply religious individual, utterly devoted to his sun god, simply incapable of understanding or conforming to Roman expectations? Was his defiance of gender norms a conscious act of identity, or simply another expression of his uninhibited personality? Historians still argue whether his actions were purely capricious or if they held a deeper, albeit bizarre, ideological underpinning, perhaps rooted in his Syrian cultural background. This is where the quirky tidbit comes in. He was, in a strange way, a performance artist on the imperial stage, constantly pushing boundaries and challenging perceptions, even if it led to his downfall. The idea of the laughter ban itself remains a fascinating, if somewhat murky, fringe tidbit of history. While unlikely to have been a literal, enforceable law, it serves as a powerful metaphor for the atmosphere of his reign, a time when joy was indeed suppressed by an emperor who seemed to prefer solemnity and obedience over genuine mirth. It highlights the profound clash between Elagabalus's personal vision and the expectations of the empire he ruled. It's a testament to how even the most intangible aspects of human experience, like laughter, can be impacted by political power. Ultimately, Elagabalus's legacy is one of extreme contrast. He was a teenager with absolute power who cared little for military conquest or traditional governance, choosing instead to focus on religious reform, personal indulgence, and a continuous parade of the bizarre. His reign was short, lasting only 4 years, but it left an indelible mark on Roman history, not for any great achievement, but for its sheer, undeniable strangeness. He reminds us that history isn't just about grand battles and noble leaders, it's also about the oddities, the outliers, and the peculiar footnotes that reveal the incredible breadth of human behavior, even on the imperial throne. As you drift off tonight, perhaps think of the silent streets of Elagabalus's Rome, and then remember the beautiful, uninhibited sound of a genuine laugh. The Roman Empire, despite its brief flirtation with solemnity, eventually found its way back to joy, as all societies must. Sleep now, and let the echoes of history gently lull you into dreams.